2.3 million Texans lost power. 31 froze to death. Jasmine Crockett didn't blame the storm, she blamed the silence. Across from her governor, Greg Abbott hid behind independence. But Jasmine came armed with fax fire, and one mission exposed the cost of pride. 3 offers rejected. One woman stood unshaken. What happens when leaders defend freedom? By letting their own people die. Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing was called after a brutal winter storm crippled Texas's power grid and claimed lives. Lawmakers gathered to decide should Texas finally accept federal aid, but the room told a different story. Jasmine Crockett's chair was angled off to the side, facing a wall of Republicans under harsh lights. No staff, no backup. Just her alone in the crosshairs. Greg Abbott entered like he owned the chamber. Surrounded by lawyers, he rolled in slow, confident. He didn't look at Crockett. He didn't have to. His message was clear. This is my state. You don't belong here. His team adjusted cameras, opened laptops, locked in like a unit preparing for combat. Crockett didn't blink. She kept her eyes on him. She knew this wasn't just a hearing, it was a trap. But her district was freezing. Her people were dying. And if no one else would speak, she would. The committee chair gave the floor to Abbott first. He leaned forward slow and measured, as if savoring what he was about to say. Texas, he said, doesn't need Washington to teach us how to survive a little cold. The line dropped like a blade. He let the silence hold, then added, we've survived worse without handouts, and we don't need out-of-state lectures wrapped in emergency funding. A few heads on the panel nodded. One aide behind him smiled. But Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't reach for her notes. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was wind-up. Because what came next would shift the entire room. She didn't come to plead. She came prepared for a fight. And as Abbott leaned into the mic, voice calm, but eyes locked with calculated heat, Jasmine Crockett knew this was the first punch. Abbott cleared his throat, glanced at his notes, then deliberately didn't use them. Instead, he let his voice rise naturally, like a preacher delivering a sermon to a room that didn't dare blink. Texas was built by men who didn't kneel to power. From afar, he declared, letting the lines slice through the silence. He dragged every syllable of didn't kneel, pausing just long enough to let the weight land, and then turned his head, slowly, directly, at her. It wasn't just rhetoric anymore. It was a call-out, a challenge, a warning cloaked in a history lesson. He wasn't speaking to the panel. He wasn't speaking to Texans. He was speaking at her, and the message was crystal clear. You're not one of us. Then he kept going past the timer, past the raised eyebrows from the committee chair. He spoke of state rights, so-called climate emergencies, and ideological chains sent from D.C. His language grew more theatrical with every line. We've fought for our freedom, before he said, and we'll do it again with or without Washington's blessing. But nobody was listening to his words anymore. They were watching his eyes locked onto Crockett, like he wasn't just debating, but discrediting. She didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch. But she did lean in, just slightly, just enough to show she wasn't backing down. When he finally ran out of firewood, the room held its breath. Then she calmly reached for her mic. No dramatics, no clearing her throat, just quiet steel. With respect, Governor, she said every word razor sharp. I was born in Austin. I grew up here. I went to school here. And 760,000 Texans sent me to Congress to fight for them. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It didn't need to. The restraint in her tone was louder than any outburst. Her facts were clean. Her presence undeniable. The line wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a re-anchoring of truth in a room that had been tilting toward performance. And yet that was exactly what shattered the mask. Abbott leaned back slightly, then forward again, slow and deliberate. His lips curled not into a smile, but into something colder. You may have been born here, he said, voice low but sharp as broken glass, but you don't represent real Texas. No one moved. No one breathed. That line didn't echo, it detonated. Every lawyer, every staffer, every senator in the room felt it. Some shifted in their seats. One aide scribbled something furiously, then stopped mid-sentence. The legal advisors behind Abbott stiffened. Realizing what had just happened, he hadn't attacked her policy. He'd attacked her identity. Crockett didn't blink. But the damage wasn't in her face, it was in the room. The shift was instant. Political theater had just turned personal, and everyone could feel the walls closing in. For the first time in the hearing, the room wasn't with Abbott. It was watching him. He'd crossed a line. Not legally, not technically, but morally and publicly. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't even needed to raise her voice to force him there. The room hadn't moved since Abbott's last line. His words still lingered in the air like the sting of a slap that no one wanted to acknowledge. But Jasmine Crockett didn't react, not with anger, not with sarcasm. She simply opened her folder. Slowly, deliberately. The sound of the clasp clicking open felt louder than it should have. Her expression didn't change, but something in the air did. Her hand slid across the desk, pulling out a single document, like a prosecutor drawing her final weapon. When she spoke, her voice was low, but lethal. According to the Department of Energy, she said without looking up, 2.3 million Texans lost power during the storm. 31 people died from cold exposure. And dozens of hospitals were forced to evacuate patients, some in the middle of emergency procedures. No exaggeration, no commentary, just the numbers and the horror that lived inside them. She placed the report flat on the table. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her voice didn't waver. And here are 12 letters from city mayors across Texas, 5 of them. Republicans urging this administration to accept federal assistance. She read out a few of the cities: Lubbock, McAllen, Midland, Amarillo, Waco. Each name another point of pressure, another civic leader begging for help while the governor stayed silent. She didn't raise her voice, but the tension was rising anyway. People shifted in their chairs. One aide stopped typing. Another pressed his earpiece tighter as if hoping to hear something else. Then Abbott struck. "Those are cherry-picked numbers," he said sharply. "One-sided stats designed to paint a disaster worse than it was. This isn't a tragedy, it's a headline. And you're using it for politics." The blow landed hard, but Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't even respond to the insult. Instead, she reached for another document, this one marked with a federal seal. She raised it just high enough for the camera to see. This, she said, her tone now even colder, is a report from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. She paused. "Let the acronym settle. It documents 3 separate offers of federal emergency aid, each one formally declined by your office." Now she looked up, eyes locked with Abbott's. "The only condition was modernizing parts of our grid to handle future storms. You said no 3 times. Then she tapped the FEMA report once, just once, but the sound was deafening in its finality. She didn't add anything else. She didn't need to. The page spoke louder than any accusation. And in that silence, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the balance of power itself. The weight of the FEMA report still hung in the air, but Abbott wasn't listening anymore. Not really. You could see it in the way his jaw tensed, how his hands clenched under the table. The kind of tight, furious stillness that always comes right before a man snaps. The evidence had landed, the room had turned, and Crockett hadn't even raised her voice. That's what made it worse. She was calm, controlled. And that control in Abbott's eyes wasn't strength, it was humiliation. That was when he finally cracked. He turned slowly, facing her with eyes that no longer held calculation, only contempt. "You're a low-level congresswoman chasing the spotlight." He hissed the words, cutting sharper than any policy critique. "This whole thing is just a performance, and we all know it." The tone wasn't political, it was personal. So personal, it drew a sharp breath from someone in the gallery. Even members of his own party flinched. The attack wasn't just insulting, it was beneath the office he held. One of the state senators, trying to break the rising tension, raised his hand and spoke gently. "Let's stay focused, Governor," he said with forced diplomacy. "We're here to discuss policy, not people." But Abbott had already crossed that line, and now there was no coming back. His face flushed a deep, angry red. His left hand trembled slightly, his right clenched into a fist. And then, before anyone could stop it, he snapped. With a violent slam that sent a tremor down the long oak table, Abbott's palm struck the surface hard. Microphones cracked from the sudden feedback. The sound of his glass tipping over came half a second later, followed by the sharp crack of it shattering on the marble floor. Water and ice scattered across the floor like debris from a detonation. He didn't wait. He didn't breathe. He roared. "Stay out of Texas." The volume of it shook the walls. It wasn't a statement, it was an eruption. A public, unfiltered meltdown captured by every live microphone in the room. Every face turned. Every pen stopped moving. And then silence. The silence wasn't awkward. It was terrifying. The kind of silence that comes after something irreversible has been said. The kind of silence that drowns an entire chamber in dread. Crockett didn't speak. No one did. Even the stenographer had paused, fingers frozen above the keys. Abbott's hand still gripped the edge of the table, like a man who'd just realized he'd pushed too far too fast, but was too proud to pull back. And in that stillness, one truth began to settle over the room, like ash from an explosion. This wasn't power. It was panic caught live on record. The silence after Abbott's outburst wasn't just heavy, it was radioactive. His words, "Stay out of Texas," were still echoing in the walls, like a shot fired in the wrong direction. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't glance around the room for support. She didn't need anyone to rescue her, because she knew exactly what she was about to do. While the governor was still fuming, his knuckles white on the edge of the desk, Crockett did the one thing no one expected. She stayed still. The kind of stillness that signals control, not fear. The kind of stillness that lets you aim. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, surgical. No anger, no emotion, just precision. "I never left Texas," she said, clear enough for the farthest corner of the hearing room. "I'm here because I was elected to be here." Her words didn't echo. They sank. And for the first time all day, no one interrupted. She reached down, not fast, not showy, just deliberate, and opened her folder again. This time she pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded once, yellowed at the corners, marked with a seal the cameras could clearly zoom in on. She didn't wave it. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held it up, wrist still, gaze locked. Then she laid it down in front of her like a final verdict. "I was born in Austin," she said. "I live here. And I've never taken a single dollar from out-of-state corporations to keep my mouth shut." The way she said it, without blinking, without breathing hard, wasn't defiance. It was dismissal. Dismissal of every accusation, every insult, every attempt to erase her. Her tone didn't rise, but the room did. The shift was instant. Abbott had shouted for dominance. Crockett had whispered and taken it back. The silence that followed wasn't fear this time. It was realization. Everyone in that room now knew she hadn't come to defend herself. She had come to remind them whose state this really was. The room hadn't moved for nearly a minute. After Crockett's quiet but cutting declaration of her roots, the hearing chamber fell into a tense stillness. But she wasn't here to win on sentiment. She was here to rip off the mask. And now it was time for the blade. Crockett leaned forward, not aggressively, but deliberately, as if shifting the weight of the entire room with her motion. Her fingers reached back into the folder she'd kept closed until now. This wasn't a speech. This wasn't prepared talking points. It was Exhibit A. She pulled out a thick stapled packet and slid it onto the desk face up. The title glared under the lights like a spotlight turning on in a dark theater. Greg Abbott for Governor, Financial Disclosure Filings. A neon tab marked the page she'd memorized. She flipped to it without hesitation. She didn't lift her voice. She didn't rise. But when she spoke, every syllable cut with surgical precision. 67% of your campaign donations, she said slowly, came from out-of-state donors. The effect was immediate and seismic. A tremor of reaction swept through the committee like wind through a wheat field. One aide froze mid-note. Another turned to whisper to their neighbor, only to find them already stunned into silence. Abbott's jaw twitched. Just barely. But in a room full of cameras, it was more than enough to register. The facade had cracked, if only for a second. But Crockett wasn't done. Without breaking eye contact with the moment, she slowly turned her face, not to the governor, not to the panel of lawmakers, but straight to the camera broadcasting live to millions. The silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that only comes right before the shot is fired. And then she delivered it. "So who's really controlling Texas from the outside?" Her voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. The weight of her question wasn't in its volume, it was in its truth. And the hearing chamber, once filled with defiant energy, suddenly felt smaller, like a stage that had just been hijacked by reality. All eyes were on Abbott, but for the first time he had nothing to say. No Texas metaphor, no comeback, no thunderous slogan to shout over the facts. Just one number one camera and one woman who had waited long enough to speak. The silence in the room was no longer just discomfort, it had turned into a verdict. Crockett's final question still echoed in the heads of everyone present. So who's really controlling Texas from the outside? But as the gravity of that moment hung thick in the air, Governor Abbott knew he couldn't let it settle. He couldn't afford to let the cameras or the country see a pause as a concession. So he fired back. With a tight jaw and a forced calmness, Abbott leaned toward the mic and delivered a line designed not to inform, but to belittle. Congresswoman Crockett doesn't understand the Constitution. He said it slowly, almost theatrically, as if reciting a classroom correction to a student who dared raise her hand. His voice carried the same tone one might use to explain arithmetic to a child, condescending, dismissive, deliberately small. The words rang out across the chamber, landing like a slap disguised as a lecture. A few members of the panel shifted in their chairs, unsure whether to nod or hide. Crockett didn't blink. Her spine remained straight, her hands still. There was no fire in her expression, just focus. Because she knew something Abbott didn't, he'd just walked into the exact trap she'd set. Without a word, she reached down and slowly pulled out a small worn booklet from her folder. Its cover was bent from use. The gold-lettered words, "The Constitution of the United States," glinted under the fluorescent lights. She held it up not for theatrics, but for clarity. This wasn't a prop. It was the foundation. She placed it gently on the table in front of her, then flipped it open with practiced hands. Each turn of the page echoed like a countdown. She wasn't just reaching for text, she was reaching for the core of the American promise. Her fingers stopped at a tab marked in yellow. Then she spoke low and steady, her voice clear but unshaken. Article 1, Section 8, she said, "The power to provide for the general welfare." She let the words sit, then tapped the page once with her finger, just loud enough to be picked up by the microphone. "That includes disaster relief. That includes federal assistance." Her tone didn't rise, but her presence did. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was educating the room. She wasn't flailing for ground. She was anchoring the hearing back to truth. Abbott leaned back slightly. His jaw tightened again, this time involuntarily. He knew what was coming even before she reached for the next document. It was the momentum shift no soundbite could undo. Crockett reached into her folder one more time and removed the printed text of the federal disaster relief bill that had been proposed and ignored. She didn't wave it. She didn't slam it down. She laid it flat on the table like a final piece of evidence submitted into record. Then she looked up. Not at Abbott, not at the chairperson. She looked directly into the eyes of every lawmaker on the committee. Her gaze moved slowly, deliberately from left to right. Some looked back. Most looked away. And then, with the stillness of someone who had waited long enough, she delivered the second detonation. "I read every line of the relief bill," she said. "And I have to ask, has anyone here actually read it, or are we just rejecting it? Because the signature at the bottom belongs to a president from the other party?" The chamber didn't stir. It convulsed. Her words landed like a wrecking ball in a museum of spin. For all the posturing and Texas bravado Abbott had brought into the room, she had just exposed the core of the resistance. Not law, not budget, not sovereignty, just politics. Cold, tribal, performative politics. For a split second, no one breathed. Aides who had been typing suddenly froze mid-keystroke. Members who had previously nodded in rhythm with Abbott's swagger now sat still, unsure whether silence meant loyalty or complicity. The chairman stared at his pen, unsure whether to tap it or throw it. Abbott looked straight ahead, but it was clear his hearing had narrowed to one voice, and it wasn't his own. His constitutional argument now lay flat, gutted by the very document he claimed to defend. Still seated, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't need to. The room had already crowned the victor. And the silence that followed wasn't respectful, it was exposed. Because in one paragraph, she hadn't just defended herself. She'd indicted the entire game. The silence after Crockett's final question wasn't just uncomfortable, it was defining. Not a whisper, not a cough, not a shifting chair. Her words had landed like a steel gavel, and the room had no verdict to offer. The hearing had begun with arrogance and noise posturing and performance. But now, in the last seconds, no one could summon a rebuttal. And Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for one. She rose not suddenly but deliberately, like someone exiting a battlefield after the final shot had already been fired. Her folder remained on the table, her water untouched. There were no hasty goodbyes, no need for further punctuation. Her silence now was the punctuation. She didn't glance at Abbott. She didn't glance at anyone. Her heels clicked softly against the tile, each step echoing in a room that had once bristled with dominance, but now sagged under the weight of a single voice that had outlasted them all. The door closed behind her with a slow, hollow thud. Inside, the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Some lawmakers lowered their eyes, ashamed to meet one another's gaze. A few aides scrambled to adjust their notes, pretending to busy themselves with protocols that didn't matter anymore. Abbott's team sat rigid, expressions frozen in place, as if still trying to process what had just occurred. And Abbott himself, once roaring, once commanding, now sat utterly still, his face tight, jaw clenched. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Outside the chamber, the air felt different. Not lighter, just charged. Like the seconds after a lightning strike. The hallway outside was lined with stiff-backed chairs, flag emblems, and polished brass nameplates. But the ceremonial calm of government halls could no longer conceal the tremor that had been set off. Crockett didn't need to speak. Her silence followed her like a shadow, heavier than words, louder than applause. In the adjacent waiting lounge, tension snapped like rubber bands. A pair of junior legal staffers from the Oversight Subcommittee whispered furiously over an open laptop. A Republican strategist paced by the window, pressing two fingers to his temple, muttering, "We should have pulled her time. We should have controlled it better." No one was recording, but everyone was documenting. One aide clutched the printed hearing transcript like it was radioactive. Another swiped feverishly through a list of reporters' numbers, unsure who would break first, his office or the media. No video was leaked. Not that hour. Not that night. The camera feeds had been handled carefully, professionally. But the truth didn't need to be streamed, because the transcript by law was public. And every sentence, every name, every accusation was already in the record. It couldn't be unsaid. It couldn't be denied. By the time the footage ever aired, the damage would have already been done in ink. Meanwhile, Crockett stood at the end of the hallway, half illuminated by a strip of sun slicing through the marble blinds. She didn't look back. Her posture wasn't victorious, but resolved. The kind of stillness that doesn't demand attention, but commands it anyway. She didn't move, didn't reach for her phone, didn't lean on the wall. She just stood there, composed, grounded, present. Then a quiet vibration buzzed in her coat pocket. She slid the phone out, glancing at the screen. A name flashed, a number tied to neither party, a voice known for cutting through chaos like a scalpel through fog. It was a sitting independent member of Congress, someone who didn't usually make courtesy calls. She answered simply, "This is Jasmine." There was no need for introduction. The man on the other end didn't ask her how the hearing went. He didn't offer a congratulations or a strategy debrief. All he gave her was a single line, quiet but weighted like a judge reading a sentence that would outlive the courtroom. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be amplified, it just needs to be said at the right moment. Crockett didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough again. In another hallway, two communications officers from rival Senate offices stood near a coffee cart, both pretending to stir sugar into cups that had long gone cold. One broke first. She didn't even raise her voice. The other nodded slowly. That's what made it dangerous. Even as the hearing officially adjourned behind them, even as the news cycle moved on, those inside that room would remember the moment, not because of what was shouted, but because of what was heard. Not because of a headline, but because a single voice grounded in unshaken truth refused to play by the script. No one expected her to shift the tide, and yet she had, without storming out, without demanding justice in all caps, without even needing a closing statement. She just stood, spoke, stopped, and in doing so she proved something even louder than protest. You don't have to raise your voice when every word you say is already a hammer. The moment Jasmine Crockett left the hearing room, the air itself changed. Not because she slammed the door, she didn't. Not because she said something bold on the way out, she didn't. She simply stood, gathered her folder, and walked with the same quiet fire she had carried into the building. But silence when charged with truth has a weight. And the silence she left behind in that chamber was heavier than anything said that entire day. No gavel strike could match it. No rebuttal could erase it. Abbott might have shouted, but she had spoken last. And everyone in that room knew it. In the waiting area outside, the tension didn't dissolve. It detonated. Staffers from both parties hovered near vending machines trying not to make eye contact. Aides typed quickly into their phones, unsure if they were documenting fallout or managing damage. One Republican speechwriter whispered, "He said stay out of Texas on live mic. That's going to live forever." Another junior policy analyst barely out of grad school turned to her mentor and asked did she plan that. The mentor didn't answer, because they all knew nothing about Jasmine Crockett's performance had been planned. It had been earned. Every line, every pause, every document placed on the table had carried the weight of someone who wasn't defending a career, but defending a home. No one leaked the footage. Not yet. There were no flashy edits, no clipped sound bites spreading like wildfire online. And yet by that evening, the Capitol felt different, because the official transcript of the hearing, required by law to be public, began circulating among journalists, policy teams, and legal advisors. And what they read wasn't a debate. It was a dismantling. Every paragraph of Crockett's responses had been measured, sourced, and deliberate. The FEMA memo, the Merrill letters, the birth certificate, the campaign finance records. All were real. All were verifiable. And no one from Abbott's camp had challenged a single fact. Inside Washington, news doesn't move. It hums, then explodes. And by the following Monday, the hum reached the marble walls of the House of Representatives. A letter dry in tone but sharp in implication was sent from the House Oversight Subcommittee on Disaster Funding. It didn't call out Abbott by name. It didn't even mention the word hearing. But it posed a direct, unflinching question. Why did the state of Texas decline 3 separate federally authorized emergency aid packages during a Category 1 energy disaster? And then just beneath that, please submit records of communication with federal agencies between the dates of January 4th and February 20th. Abbott's office didn't hold a press conference. There was no rallying cry, no flag-wrapped podium moment. At 5:41 a.m. the next morning, before any press had even begun their shift, a quiet, controlled statement was released to a curated list of email subscribers and political reporters. Texas will accept aid consistent with its constitutionally delegated authority. 12 words, 2 legal-sounding terms, 0 accountability. It was meant to sound sovereign, measured, unbothered. But it only confirmed what everyone had seen during the hearing. He was shaken. The Greg Abbott who once dared the federal government to stay out was now choosing language softer than parchment. And the people of Texas. They weren't fooled, because in the absence of press spins and online flame wars, a different kind of ripple was beginning, one that didn't trend but stuck. In community centers across Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, small handwritten signs began appearing. Jasmine Crockett speaks Tuesday, 6 p.m. Free to all. No sponsor, no party logo. Just a name, a time, and a chair. The first event was at a library branch in Fort Worth. Capacity 100. Attendance 240. People stood in aisles, sat on floors, and leaned against walls. No one came to chant. No one held signs. They came to listen. One older veteran whispered to a teacher beside him, "I didn't even know we were allowed to talk like that." In Crockett's first sentence, she made no mention of Abbott. She didn't gloat. She didn't repeat sound bites. She opened with a simple line, "Power isn't loud. It's whether you can stay standing when someone else tries to sit you down." And for the next hour, she didn't talk about herself. She talked about systems, how they fail, how they're rigged, and how silence keeps them alive. The tour wasn't organized. It wasn't funded. It was requested. In Midland, a high school civics teacher emailed her team asking if Crockett would speak to their AP government class. In El Paso, a Latino community board asked if she'd join a bilingual roundtable on disaster response. In Lubbock, a church coalition invited her to lead a forum titled How to Keep Your Soul When the Room's Designed to Break You. She didn't wear power suits. She didn't bring notes. And she never repeated her quotes from the hearing. Because this wasn't a campaign trail, it was a reckoning. One woman walking into rooms built to ignore people like her and forcing them to feel not just the facts, but the weight behind the facts. Because when Crockett looked a crowd in the eye and said I was born in Austin, I haven't taken $1 from out-of-state donors to stay quiet, it wasn't politics, it was testimony. Back in the Capitol, whispers grew louder. Some lawmakers asked why Crockett hadn't been given more committee influence sooner. Others wondered aloud whether the governor's outburst had cost him more than his dignity. But in Texas, in fire halls and union basements, in school auditoriums, people weren't asking about Abbott anymore. They were asking something else entirely. Why did it take a winter storm to finally hear someone speak for us? And quietly, without fanfare, a shift was happening, one Crockett didn't orchestrate, but had undeniably sparked. For once, the echo chamber wasn't in Washington. It was in the rooms where people remembered every word, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't stormed. She hadn't even raised her voice. But somehow she had changed the temperature in every room she entered without touching the thermostat. And this time, no one could tell her to stay out of Texas, because she never left. The storm didn't end when Jasmine Crockett walked out of that hearing room. In fact, it was only just beginning. The silence she left behind didn't dissolve, it spread like a pressure system building over the state. Conversations turned into questions, questions into strategy, and strategy into fallout. Within days, a visible tremor ran through the marble veins of Texas's political machine. In the next session of the state legislature, 2 seats at the governor's executive policy table were left glaringly empty. They weren't absent due to illness. They hadn't been reassigned. They were vacant, cold, final, and quiet. Both senior aides to Abbott had resigned without warning. One was his longest-serving legal advisor, the other a communications chief who'd crafted half his national messaging. Now both were gone. No statements, no farewell tours. Just 2 resignation letters quietly time-stamped, submitted and accepted. Those empty chairs didn't go unnoticed. Lawmakers, some of whom had flanked Abbott with unwavering loyalty, started to whisper. Behind closed doors in side hallways and committee lounges, they began to reassess. Not just his leadership, but their own silence. Within 72 hours, whispers turned to paper. Legislative aides began drafting proposals, low profile, at first buried in subcommittees, but unmistakable in meaning. One bill proposed that in emergency scenarios, the governor's veto power should require bipartisan review. Another called for a limit on executive override during federally recognized disaster declarations. These weren't radical revolutions, but they were rebellions nonetheless. The kind of subtle but seismic pushback that signals one undeniable truth: the throne was no longer untouchable. Abbott, for his part, attempted containment. He released a 2-line statement: Texas will accept federal aid within the scope of constitutional authority. It was vague, it was careful, and it was too late. Texans weren't waiting for permission to form opinions they already had. They'd seen the hearing. They'd heard the scream. They'd watched one woman remain composed while the most powerful man in the state lost control on live TV. And now they remembered. No social media campaign followed. No trending hashtags, no viral memes. What happened next unfolded the old-fashioned way, in community centers, city councils, and union halls. Jasmine Crockett didn't go on CNN. She didn't hold press briefings. She declined invitations from late-night hosts and Sunday morning anchors. When asked why, she gave the same answer every time: I'm not here to entertain. I'm here to represent. But she didn't disappear either. Instead, her name quietly appeared on programs across Texas, in flyers taped to school doors, in bulletins mailed to churches, in whispered recommendations passed between PTA meetings. Local organizations, many of them apolitical, began requesting her presence. Not as a politician, but as a teacher. They didn't ask her to rehash the hearing. They asked her to share how she stayed calm when the room caught fire, how she kept her voice steady when the table shook. One recurring event stood out above the rest: a recurring series hosted at public libraries titled "Leading When the Mic Isn't Yours." And she showed up, every time. One particular evening at a library in East Austin, the room filled beyond capacity. Folding chairs were added, then cushions on the floor. Some stood by the windows. Among them were high school students, retired veterans, single parents, and a few small-town mayors who sat quietly in the back. Crockett arrived alone. No staff, no notes, just her and a folded copy of the U.S. Constitution tucked inside a canvas bag. She didn't take the podium when it was offered. She stood at eye level, made contact with everyone in the room, and opened simply, "What happened last week wasn't just politics, it was a test. And it's one we're all still in." For the next hour, she didn't talk about power. She talked about pressure. She described the moment when Abbott's hands slammed down when the room froze, and how she chose not to meet his volume, but to center herself in truth. She said, "You don't win by shouting louder. You win by refusing to lie." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They leaned in silent, hungry. Midway through the evening, a young woman stood up no older than 22 and asked how Crockett found the strength not to shout back. Jasmine paused. Then she said, "Because that wasn't a moment for ego. It was a moment for service. He lost control. I kept the room." And you could feel it, the weight of that sentence settle across every chest. The questions kept coming. Not about policy, but about poise. How do you know when to speak, when to stay still? When does silence make the loudest point? Crockett answered each with the patience of someone who'd already lived through 1,000 versions of that question in rooms without cameras, without microphones, without backup. She reminded them that leadership doesn't begin when you're called to speak, it begins when you choose to listen. By the end of the night, no one moved to leave. Not right away. They stayed seated, quiet, reflective, as if to hold on to the gravity of the moment before the outside world returned. One man, an older veteran with his campaign cap folded in his lap, approached her quietly as she packed her bag. He didn't offer praise, he simply said, "You didn't flinch. That matters more than anything they said." She smiled, nodded, and walked out the side door into the night. There were no camera crews waiting, no headlines published the next morning, but the echo carried. Within days, universities requested her for forums. Small towns requested her for roundtables. Even faith groups across denomination and ideology reached out for guidance on how to lead with dignity when pushed to the edge. She didn't accept all of them, but she accepted enough. Enough to prove that what happened in that Capitol chamber wasn't a media stunt. It was a shift. Not everyone was on board. Some critics accused her of exploiting the moment. Others claimed her calm was scripted. But those voices rang hollow because the footage didn't lie. It showed her hands still, her voice measured, her facts exact, and it showed a governor unraveling in real time. That image couldn't be undone. And more importantly, it couldn't be denied. Meanwhile, inside the Texas legislature, a new tone emerged. No one openly blamed Abbott for the fallout, but they no longer rushed to defend him either. In one committee session, a state senator remarked, "We may need to rethink what emergency powers mean." Another replied, "Or at least who we trust to use them." Neither used Crockett's name. They didn't have to. Her presence hovered over every debate, not as a ghost, but as a recalibration. And through it all, Crockett kept moving library by library, forum by forum. She never referred to herself as victorious, never claimed she'd won anything. When asked what she hoped came out of all this, she answered plainly, that people start reading again. Bills, budgets, ballots, and each other. It wasn't a slogan, it was a call. She hadn't just testified at a hearing, she'd lit a match. And now across Texas, people were learning how to carry the flame. The flame Jasmine Crockett lit in that hearing room didn't flicker out. It burned quietly, methodically into the marrow of a generation. 6 months later, the Capitol corridors didn't echo with her name, but her presence lingered in ways no one could ignore. In a sterile conference room on the 4th floor of a federal training facility in Arlington, a group of young policy fellows gathered for what they thought would be a routine leadership module. But when the screen lit up, it wasn't a senator or a former president delivering a keynote. It was a clip 38 seconds long. Jasmine Crockett, still, calm, her voice unwavering. "I read every line of the aid bill," she said. "Then I wonder if anyone here did the same, or are you just opposing it because the signature belongs to a president from the other party?" The room fell silent. No one looked away. A senior instructor paused the video. "Let's discuss what just happened," he said, but no one answered right away. Finally, one young woman raised her hand and said, "She didn't just answer. She reclaimed the entire room without ever raising her voice." The instructor nodded. That clip, as they would soon learn, had been officially integrated into the federal leadership curriculum for rising policy analysts and senior advisors classified under ethics and equilibrium under pressure. It wasn't just a case study in communication. It was a blueprint in restraint. In the weeks that followed, Crockett's name was cited not as a politician, but as a principal. The moment had transcended its setting. It was now a mirror held up to every future leader who'd ever be tempted to shout before thinking. That clip found its way into other rooms too. In a graduate seminar at Georgetown, in a judicial ethics workshop in Chicago, in a military officer's course on command presence. But it wasn't just the footage that stuck, it was the sentence that followed in one of the most widely read articles of that year. A respected scholar from Columbia penned it in The Atlantic under the headline, "The Day Jasmine Crockett Proved That Strength Doesn't Shout." The article tore through political circles like wildfire. It wasn't partisan, it wasn't personal, it was clinical and cutting. It broke down frame by frame how in a room built for intimidation, one woman had outmaneuvered an entire power structure by simply refusing to lose her ground. She didn't escalate. She exposed, the scholar wrote, and in doing so, she redrew the perimeter of power. Meanwhile, Greg Abbott remained in office. He gave no concession speeches. He offered no apologies. He went back to work as if the walls hadn't trembled. But something had changed, not in his schedule, but in his shadow. He was still governor, yes, but the air around him no longer carried the weight it once had. His public appearances were more measured. His rhetoric, once thunderous, had been dialed down to carefully worded talking points. Even his press team began using phrases like aligned with federal cooperation and nonpartisan coordination, language that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The fire he once wielded now smoldered under the surface. The image of dominance had cracked, and behind it stood a man still powerful, but no longer feared. Inside political circles, no one said it aloud, but they all understood it. Abbott hadn't lost his seat. He'd lost his invincibility. That hearing had become a watermark dividing his tenure into two eras, before Crockett and after Crockett. Some staffers even coined it sarcastically as BC and AC when organizing internal timelines. Meetings were held with more eyes watching. Vetoes were signed with more disclaimers attached. And when the next crisis loomed, reporters didn't ask what Abbott planned to do. They asked whether he'd consult with Congresswoman Crockett's office. It wasn't that Jasmine had become untouchable. It was that she'd made the cost of ignoring her too high. And Abbott, whether he'd admit it or not, had paid that cost publicly. More than once during closed-door briefings, aides would catch his eyes flicking toward the door whenever her name appeared in memos. Not in fear, but in calculation. Because he knew now silence couldn't erase the impact of that hearing, and bravado couldn't erase its replay. It lived in documents, yes, but more dangerously, it lived in people's minds. In the months that followed, Jasmine never spoke about Abbott directly. She didn't need to. She understood something rare in today's politics: what's felt doesn't always need to be said. She focused instead on institutional repair, on holding town halls about constitutional literacy, on revisiting legislation regarding state-level emergency powers. She pushed quietly for mechanisms that would prevent future governors of any party from weaponizing silence against suffering. And yet the public always brought the conversation back to that day. In every Q&A, someone mentioned the moment Abbott slammed his hand and shouted, "Stay out of Texas." And every time Jasmine responded the same way, with a half smile and the words, "I never left." And that's what stuck. That was the sentence etched not into law, but into memory. Across the state, it became a quiet mantra spoken at protests, printed on posters, whispered in union halls. Not screamed, not branded, but remembered. I never left. It wasn't just a declaration of presence. It was a refusal to be erased, to be silenced, to be exiled from the place she belonged to simply because she dared to speak when silence was more convenient. Behind the scenes, other state officials began to recalibrate. Some privately reached out to Crockett's team for advice. A few quietly adjusted their language and speeches, borrowing her calm cadence without credit. And a handful who once mocked her started quoting her lines in legislative sessions, hoping perhaps that echoing her tone might lend them a fraction of her moral clarity. But the public wasn't fooled. They knew who had stood when it mattered, and they knew who had simply adjusted to the wind after the storm had passed. Meanwhile, in a university classroom far from the Capitol, a professor played the clip again, this time for a group of first-year law students. When it ended, he turned to the class and said, "This is what it looks like when someone uses the law not to defend themselves, but to defend the people the law was written for." A student raised their hand and asked, "Did the governor ever respond?" The professor paused, then said, "He didn't need to." The silence after she spoke was louder than any rebuttal could have been. Outside that classroom, beyond DC, beyond Austin, beyond politics, something deeper was shifting. A generation of future leaders watching that clip, reading that article, feeling that silence began to understand that true strength doesn't require spectacle, that power without purpose is just noise, and that sometimes the most important sentence isn't shouted, it's the one that arrives like a quiet, steady heartbeat in the middle of chaos. And so even as Abbott returned to his post, even as press cycles moved on the ground beneath the Capitol, remained forever altered. Not with fireworks, not with indictments, but with one woman in one chair refusing to surrender her breath to a room demanding her silence. She didn't flinch. She didn't fold. She didn't shout. She simply stayed. And Texas, no matter what it claimed to remember, would never forget. And yet for all the reports, the headlines, the reshuffled committees, and the legislative footnotes, none of them carried the weight of what came next. Not a law, not a bill, not a press release, just a letter. Folded in thirds, creased with care, it arrived on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's desk with no return address, no campaign logo, no postmark from a Capitol Hill office. Just a scrawled name on the corner, Helen Ramirez, a mother from Lubbock. No fanfare, no staff review. It was tucked between policy briefs and scheduling memos, easy to miss, easy to overlook, except for the uneven ink and the shaky handwriting that made it feel alive in a sea of sterile paper. And when Jasmine opened it, the air in her office shifted like someone had cracked a window into something older, deeper. The letter began simply. "Dear Congresswoman Crockett," it read, "you don't know me, and you don't need to." It was written on the back of a grocery store flyer, the kind with meat prices and discount laundry detergent. But every line was carved in lived truth. Helen wrote about the winter storm 2 years prior, the night the lights went out, the hours her kids huddled under blankets, how she melted snow on the stove for formula, how she heard on the radio that help was coming, but it never came. "My youngest kept asking me, 'Why is it so cold if we're still in our house?'" she wrote. "I told him we were just camping. But I was lying. We weren't camping. We were surviving." As Jasmine kept reading, her fingers paused at every turn. Helen wasn't writing to complain. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't quoting policy or referencing budgets. She wasn't even angry. Her words held something far heavier: memory. "I saw the hearing," the next line said. "I don't remember everything you said. I don't remember everything he said either. I'm not good at politics, but I remember you sat there, and you didn't move. You didn't leave." Jasmine stared at that line longer than the others. It wasn't grand. It wasn't poetic. But it was the heartbeat of everything she had ever tried to do. It was the sentence that made the headlines irrelevant. The rest of the letter was just as raw. Helen admitted she didn't vote in the last election. She wasn't proud of it. She was tired, disillusioned. "They tell us we have a voice," she wrote, "but it's hard to believe that when you're holding 2 babies and the thermostat says 42 degrees. But watching Jasmine sit through that hearing, while others shouted, stormed, or spun, meant something to her. You didn't try to win, you just didn't back down. That's what I'll remember." And then came the line, the one that landed heavier than applause, heavier than a committee ruling, heavier than any gavel ever dropped in DC. "I don't remember all the politics, but I will always remember the woman who sat there and didn't leave." Jasmine folded the letter slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't call a press conference. She didn't post it on social media. She just placed it in the top drawer of her desk next to her copy of the Constitution, the one she brought to every hearing, every vote, every moment where someone tried to question if she belonged. That drawer now didn't just carry legal precedent, it carried lived proof. A reminder that while the law could draw lines and power could draw blood, memory, real human memory, drew the maps people actually followed when everything else failed. In the months that followed, Jasmine would be asked a dozen times what her proudest moment was in that hearing. She never gave the same answer. Sometimes she said it was reading the Constitution aloud. Sometimes it was calling out the funding from out-of-state corporations. But privately, quietly, the real answer was always the same. It wasn't anything she said. It was that she stayed. When everything in that room tried to push her out, when the governor raised his voice, when the tension cracked the silence, when every eye waited for her to flinch, she didn't. She stayed. For Helen. For women like Helen. For the ones whose thermostat read 42 degrees and whose stories never made it past the kitchen floor. She understood now that leadership wasn't about flipping a vote. It wasn't about viral clips or eloquent sound bites. It was about presence, about refusing to vanish when the room demanded your silence, about holding space even when that space was cracked hostile and built to exclude you. Jasmine hadn't planned on being remembered. She came to argue policy, but she left as a memory and not one crafted by campaign staff or scripted by consultants. A memory written in the cold breath of a mother's winter. And that kind of memory, it doesn't fade with news cycles. What followed was quiet. Helen's letter was never published. No one turned it into a commercial, but word got out through interns, aides, friends of staffers who couldn't keep it to themselves. And slowly it became a story told in whispers, in cafeterias, in break rooms. Did you hear about the letter? Yeah, the one from the mom during the blackout. They say she didn't even ask for anything, just said thank you, because Crockett didn't leave. In a city built on noise, that silence spoke louder than anything. And in those retellings, Jasmine Crockett became more than a congresswoman. She became a still point, a fixed star, the woman who didn't leave when it was easier to walk out, the woman who didn't raise her voice but raised the bar. In the years ahead, policies would change, parties would shift, governors would come and go. But in every policy memo about disaster aid, in every speech on constitutional duty, someone would remember that hearing, that chair, that stillness. They'd remember that while some screamed, "Stay out of Texas," one woman simply replied with her silence and her spine. And in a state where the power once failed its people, one woman's quiet refusal to leave became the power that never did. And when the headlines faded and the clips stopped circulating and the noise of politics moved on to its next crisis, the story stayed. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. It didn't end with Jasmine Crockett. It didn't even belong to her. It belonged to something bigger, something quieter. Something about what it means to stand your ground when no one's clapping. What it means to hold the line when it doesn't trend. What it means to speak not to be seen, but because something in you refuses to stay silent. In a room built to silence her, she never raised her voice, and yet her presence echoed louder than any outburst could. There is a lesson here, one that isn't printed in policy manuals or leadership guides. It's the kind that lives in the cracks of a public hearing. It lives in the stare of a mother watching from her couch, surrounded by children and unpaid bills. It lives in the breath someone holds before standing up at a town hall meeting. It's the understanding that dignity isn't something you beg for. It's something you protect. Jasmine didn't ask for validation. She brought her own. In a country that often confuses leadership with volume, she redefined it through stillness, truth, and a refusal to flinch. The lesson isn't in the clash. It's in the calm after the silence that holds more weight than applause. That moment when she sat still as Abbott shouted wasn't about winning. It was about not walking away from the fight simply because it got ugly. And that's something every person, no matter their politics, understands in their bones. We've all been in rooms where we were outnumbered, where people spoke over us, where truth was treated like an inconvenience. Jasmine reminded us that staying planted in those rooms matters, that you don't have to scream to be unshakable. That courage doesn't always show up in combat, it shows up in composure. The kind that says, "I hear you yelling, but I'm not moving." This story isn't about Texas alone. It's about every kitchen where someone reads the fine print of a bill they didn't vote on, but now have to survive under. It's about the flood victims waiting on hold with FEMA, about the single mom juggling 2 jobs and still showing up to vote. It's about those who are told their voice doesn't matter until it does, because sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to back down to remind everyone else what strength actually looks like. And Jasmine didn't remind them with slogans. She did it with presence, with eyes that didn't blink when power tried to intimidate her. Real leadership, true moral authority doesn't come from the title on your nameplate or the size of your donor list. It comes from what you're willing to endure for the people who will never get a seat at that table. Crockett wasn't speaking for Twitter. She wasn't playing for headlines. She was speaking for those whose lives hang in the balance when the cameras are off. For them, the stakes aren't political, they're survival. And when she pulled out that birth certificate, when she read from the Constitution, when she looked straight into the lens and asked, "So who's really pulling the strings in Texas?" she wasn't performing. She was testifying. The aftermath of her stand didn't bring fireworks. It brought accountability. Quiet, stubborn, unglamorous accountability. The kind that shows up in empty chairs from resignations, in policy forums hosted in public libraries, in a mother's handwritten letter from Lubbock. Jasmine's impact didn't ride in on a trending topic. It walked in quietly and stayed. And maybe that's the deeper truth this story offers. Power is loud, but justice doesn't need to be. Sometimes justice is a woman sitting in a chair no one expected her to fill, refusing to get up. In the chaos of our politics, there is a craving for something real, not rehearsed, not edited, not spun into talking points. Just real. And real often shows up looking like Jasmine Crockett, calm in the storm, defiant in the face of disrespect, and anchored in a truth she didn't need permission to speak. That's what people remember, not the policies or even the arguments, but the fact that she stayed when others walked out. That she didn't just represent Texas, she embodied it. Its pain, its defiance, its refusal to be ignored. And maybe that's the blueprint going forward, not just for leaders, but for all of us. You don't need a microphone to speak truth. You don't need applause to do the right thing. You just need clarity, courage, and the conviction to say, "I was born here. I live here. I'm not leaving." Because when you refuse to move, the room has to. When you refuse to back down, the narrative shifts. That's what Jasmine Crockett did. That's why it mattered. That's why it still matters. In every boardroom where someone feels out of place. In every hospital where a nurse sees budget cuts instead of backup. In every school where a teacher pays for her own supplies. This story travels. Not because of who she argued with, but because of how she stayed standing after. That's the kind of leadership we should be teaching. Not how to win a debate, but how to hold your ground in the fire without becoming part of the smoke. How to say what needs to be said without forgetting who you're saying it for. This wasn't a viral moment. It was a values moment. And the people who watched, who truly saw it, didn't forget. They saw a woman bring receipts, bring law, bring lived experience into a room that tried to erase all three. And she didn't just speak truth to power. She sat down at power's table and refused to let it rewrite the story. That's more than politics. That's history. That's legacy. And that's what makes this more than just a hearing. It makes it a mirror one held up to every person who's ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or go home. And maybe the final message isn't even about Jasmine at all. Maybe it's about us, about what we tolerate, about who we choose to listen to, about what happens when someone like Helen Ramirez, who never finished high school, sees a version of herself sitting across from a governor and decides to write a letter instead of staying silent. That ripple matters. That echo travels. That one chair, that one moment reminds us justice isn't a lightning bolt. It's a heartbeat, steady, relentless, unshaken. So the next time someone tells you your voice doesn't matter, your presence doesn't count, your truth isn't polished enough, remember Jasmine Crockett. Remember the winter storm and the mother who melted snow. Remember that silence can be an indictment. That presence can be protest. That one woman in one chair without shouting can bend the arc of power just by staying exactly where she belongs. Because leadership isn't always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's the one that doesn't leave even when it would be easier to walk away. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.